Hey guys, got to tell you a super cool story. So we wanted to get together with our friends Scott and Marisa Smith and come up to the city of Ávila, the walled city, and have a chuletón, a big steak, and that's some of the best steak in the country. So we come up here, and we hadn't seen them for 3 months because they were on furlough. Anyways, the restaurant I wanted to go to was closed, so I went online and searched for another one and just found a random one called the Medieval Restaurant that had good ratings, and so we just went there. We got there a half hour before Scott and Marisa, and you know how we preach the Mina, as you go, do business with the Mina, so we just went there, and the guy came out of the restaurant, one of the waiters, and he's telling people about the menu and everything. I said, we got reservations here. He says, oh good. And then I saw something on the menu that said Judías de Barco, and I said, Barco de Ávila, that little town up in the mountains. He says, yeah. I said, I love that little town, and there's some special beans that come from that area. And then Joni says, yeah, that's where you wrote your book or whatever. And he says, you wrote a book. I says, yeah, we wrote a couple. And he said, what's it about? And I says, it's a religious book. Like, I've never answered that way before, but I said, it's a religious book. He said, I read it. Now, this is a Spaniard. He's 40 years old. He's never thought about God before. He told me that. He says, I've never thought about God before. And he said, I read a book about 3 years ago. And I said, well, what was it about? He says, it was about how to find salvation. He says, I've read it over and over and over again, but I haven't found it yet. I says, well, I wrote a book too about how to do that. And I said, so you think about those things? He says, I do. He says, I never used to think about those things, but now it was like I woke up from a sleep. Okay, guys, nobody's ever witnessed to this guy before. He's never been to a church. He doesn't, there's no TV or radio programs. It's just God sovereignly at work in this guy. It's given me so much encouragement that God's actually at work. But anyway, he says it was like I woke up from a sleep, and when I woke up, all of a sudden I realized, man, I need God. I've got sin in my life. And it was like the prodigal son coming back to the father. He knew that story because he had started reading the Bible. And then he says, so anyway, I talked to him. I said, well, that's a great thing. He says, you know what the problem is? I says, what? He says, the problem is we're living contra corriente. We're living against the current. He says, if we live against the current, everything goes wrong in our life. If we live in sin, everything goes wrong in life. But if we get in the current, if we instead of doing our will, we do God's will, then everything aligns. Well, I go, is that what you just said? I said, hardly anybody knows that truth. I said, you are so close. And he said, there's like a devil too, isn't there? I go, yeah, there's a devil. And then he says, I've had spiritual experiences, but I can't even share them with anybody because nobody understands. I said, well, you can share them with me. He says, I can. He says, when we're talking, he says, I feel, okay, guys, I keep going back to say this is a Spaniard. Spaniards traditionally aren't open to God. They don't talk this way. And so it was just blowing my mind that he was so hungry and he was searching. And he says, we got it. He says, doesn't everybody in Spain need to hear about salvation? But doesn't everybody need to know this story? I said, yeah, they do. He says, I want to tell my story of how I'm seeking for God, but I've never told anybody because I don't think anybody understands. I says, well, you will tell that. And so I asked him if he had, I didn't ask him. We were at a restaurant. I says, go get me a glass of hot water and a black tea bag. So he did, and we were standing out on the sidewalk, and I did the tea bag illustration. I says, some people are here, and some people are here, but we need Christ in us. So he wanted to know what salvation was. And I said, well, salvation is Christ in you, the Spirit of God coming in you. Then we turned to the Bible, and I showed him 2 Corinthians 5:17. If any man be in Christ, he's a new creature. Old things are passed away. Then we went to John chapter 3 on my phone, And I said, like Nicodemus, you have to be born again. You have to be born in the water physically, and then you have to be born spiritually. I said, Christ has to be in you. I said, what percentage of this water has been changed? He says, all of it. I said, that's what Jesus wants to do in your life. It was such a God moment, it was such a God moment. And he said, I said, did you understand the illustration? He said, of course, it couldn't be clear. That's exactly what I want to happen in my life. He says, but how am I to know? It's too much. He said, how am I to know unless somebody's to guide me and somebody's to teach me? But I don't have anybody. I said, okay. So here's my book, Power of the Gospel. I signed it for him. Here's my phone number. Here's my email. I says, you write me. We'll get together for coffee. Really? I said, yeah, I'll drive up from Madrid. I'll have myself a steak. When you get off work, we'll sit down and we'll talk about it. I says, let me pray for you right now, because I don't know if I'll get a chance to pray for you after we have our meal. And we just stood on the sidewalk. I said, give me your hand. And we just prayed, and we prayed for salvation for him. And he knows exactly how to be saved right now. So I'm super excited about what God's going to do with this. And now my question is, I'm meeting people at restaurants. I think I need to go out to eat more often. Steaks, so I can meet chefs and so I can meet waiters. But anyway, I'm meeting Spaniards that are seeking God all by themselves, and they don't know how to find him because they don't have anybody to tell them. And when I come across them and I'm able to add that link in that chain that brings them towards Jesus and guide them to that, now I say, now what do I do with them? Now what do I do? There's a couple of churches in the town, but I just don't think I can take Diego like this and just plop him in some church. He absolutely has zero background in all this, and I'm not here, so I need to pray, and I've been praying about this for months. Okay, God, what do you want me to do with all these Spaniards now? They're not like this so much in Puerto del Sol where we're ministering, but I find them out in our travels. They're out there, and it's God is at work. Anyway, I wanted to tell you that. Sorry. Bye.